temporary accommodation has contributed to the deaths of 16 children in London in the last 5 years. That's out of a total of 74 children for the whole of England. And official figures from the National Child Mortality Database reveal that 58 of those children were babies under the age of 1. Joining me on the line now is the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Households in Temporary Accommodation, who's also the MP for Mitcham and Morden, Siobhain McDonagh. Siobhain, you've described these figures as shocking. I think a lot of Londoners are going to be so saddened as well. What more can you tell us about these reports' findings?
They were difficult to find out, which is why it's taken so long, but shocking when discovered that the form of accommodation you're in causes potentially the death of a baby. Temporary accommodation is an increasing feature of life for large numbers of families in London.
So this is, for a lot of Londoners, this is going to be utterly shocking. It represents, as you've already said to the BBC, more than one death every month in the fifth largest economy in the world. But what is it about the type of temporary housing, do you think, that is contributing to these deaths then?
Well, it's significant. It's not having a place for the baby to sleep, not having a cot or a Moses basket. But it's also affected by damp and mould growth, disconnecting families from all their support networks, older children from school, mums and dads from work, or family or friends. It's a terrible cauldron of problems that are created, and all of them at huge expense to the taxpayer.
Last year, government guidance was changed. It recommended that local authorities help homeless families to access cots for children under the age of 2. That clearly hasn't gone far enough then. What are your thoughts on this guidance? What needs to be done here?
Well, the guidance is relatively new. It doesn't take into account the kind of complete chaos that is going on in our housing departments across every council in London. Increasing numbers of families evicted, maybe at short notice, and councils finding it harder and harder to find suitable temporary accommodation, which is often miles and miles away from the borough and from people's communities. And when a accommodation is a long way off, the council don't check it first. So they don't actually know where they're sending the families to. All they can rely on is the advice of the landlord or the agent, which in my experience is not always truthful.
That surely isn't going far enough, though, is it? It's a record 123,000 families living in temporary housing in England, and there's a lot of misconception as to what we actually define as temporary accommodation, because it covers anything that's not permanent housing. So it could be hotels, hostels, caravans, holiday parks, flats. Clearly, families are facing quite upheaval and multiple moves when homeless.
Oh, absolutely. The Mitcham and Morden is in the borough of Merton in southwest London at the bottom of the Northern Line on the tube map. And we probably have the lowest number of families in temporary accommodation in London, but our number is at about 670. Goodness. That's a number we've never been near. But we have neighbouring boroughs that have 4,500 families in temporary accommodation. Just finding that number of units, managing them, being able to make sure they reach the standard is a huge task that I think is being failed on.
As you say, there's a plethora of councils who are talking about this. Ealing Council has said there's been unprecedented numbers of residents reaching out to ask for help with emergency housing, and that 7,000 local families were on the waiting list for social homes. Clearly, something needs to change here.
Well, that's why the Labour government have a target of building 1.5 million homes in the first 5 years of its government, because we've simply not been building enough to meet the demand. In the last year, Merton, my council, has had 34 three-bedroom properties to let to people.
Okay.
And 72 two-beds. I mean, that doesn't begin to touch the sides.
To interject, though, some will be saying this isn't about the properties that are being built. This is about the actual accommodation that's currently there that, quite frankly, is not up to scratch.
But you only need temporary accommodation, and we spend billions of pounds of taxpayers' money on it every year. You only need it because we don't have the permanent homes.
So
the only solution, the only long-term solution, is building homes.
So another key concern I suspect many Londoners are going to be having is, as you've already mentioned here, the number of people in temporary accommodation is actually going up across London. So therefore, surely and sadly, the number of children at risk from death is also now going to grow.
Well, it seems absolutely shocking to say it, but the answer to that question has to be yes.
Gosh. What needs to be done? Is there anything the government or local authorities can do now as a matter of emergency, as a matter of urgency?
Well, obviously, there is a code of guidance that local authorities should work to about what is available in temporary accommodation. But when you're running to stand still to find just roofs over people's heads, then sometimes those standards aren't being met. So I would like to see a regulator like Ofsted for schools to come in from outside and look at councils and see, are they providing the sort of temporary accommodation meets the standards? Because once something is inspected and being published in tables, things get done.
As you said, though, this report's found that deaths are more likely where there's overcrowding, there's mould, there's lack of safe sleeping options. I mean, it is going to be completely and utterly shocking. I think some listeners are going to be flabbergasted that the basic checks are not being done, especially when it comes to children, to family, to babies going into these types of temporary accommodation here in London.
Yeah, people would be shocked, and quite rightly so. But there's almost a quiet war going on with families being evicted and being placed in temporary accommodation. Poor quality, a long way from schools and work and communities and friends, that often doesn't hit the headlines. It's when we get a terrible statistics like 74 children dying in temporary accommodation over a 5-year period that the issue gets the attention that you are kindly giving it this afternoon.
Are you hopeful things are going to change in the next 12 months? Because part of this is we often hear from listeners who say politicians will just talk. We need action. And clearly, especially when we are talking about losing the lives of young children, young London children.
I am hopeful. I don't think the problem will go away. I think that's going to take us a huge amount of time. But just the talking about building houses, about thinking about things like building on the green belt, about understanding the numbers of families in temporary accommodation, the consequences for them and the consequences for the taxpayer are all important building blocks just to turbocharging the building of new houses.
Sure. I just wonder whether or not Londoners feel that fundamentally we're letting our most vulnerable down here, which is the young children who are in temporary accommodation, who require the changes now, not in, 3, 4, 5 years down the line.
Well, absolutely. In an ideal world, that would be the case. But by highlighting it, people will take more notice of it, government will take more notice, and we can expect more action. Can we expect things to be sorted overnight? No, we can't.